In this episode of 21st Century Disability, we are so pleased to welcome Tiffany Yu. Tiffany is a renowned disability advocate who has broken down barriers through her work as a entrepreneur, speaker, and author. Welcome, Tiffany.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. So, Tiffany, before we begin, why don't you start by telling our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Tiffany Yu, and I'm a disability advocate, but I wasn't always one. So I became disabled almost 30 years ago. At the age of 9, I was involved in a car accident where I acquired a handful of injuries and disabilities, including permanently paralyzing one of my arms, breaking a couple bones in one of my legs. So I was a temporary wheelchair user for about 4 months during my rehabilitation period. And much later, I'd be diagnosed with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a type of mental health disability. And so fast forward a little over 10 years after I became disabled, I started getting really curious about what it might look like to build a disability-centered community, mainly because I wanted one. And I wanted to, up until that point in time, I think I harbored a lot of shame and a lot of internalized ableism around not only the validity of my disability experience and whether or not my voice mattered, but really, I guess, leaning into kind of like setting low expectations for myself in this disabled body. And so today, I run a large disability community focused on what I call the shame to pride transformation around a disability identity. That's called Diversability. I wrote this book called the Anti-Ableist Manifesto that came out last fall and is currently on its third printing. And this book to me is mainly around like educating the masses, hopefully, around what I hope all of us should know about disability and how we can show it better for the disability community. And then in addition to that, I also run a micro grant called the Awesome Foundation Disability Chapter, where we award $1,000 monthly to a disability project around the world. This year in 2025, we will surpass $100,000 of grants awarded. Uh, and then
Wow.
and then finally, I do some civic engagement type thing. So I serve on the NIH National Advisory Board for Medical Rehabilitation Research and one of the advisory boards for LA 28 Olympic and Paralympic Games around workforce development. I'm not sure if that's all the background you wanted, but I wanted to give you the whole lay of the land.
Yeah, that is amazing. I'm surprised you can remember all of it is that you are doing. That's
I will say
spectacular.
I I spent some time kind of breaking it down into these four pillars, right? Community, education, economic empowerment, and then civic engagement. And then I said the community and the education part are kind of what support my livelihood, and
Yeah,
then the micro grants and the civic engagement slash advocacy are kind of how I'm able to uh, how I'm privileged enough to have the time and space to kind of pay it forward to my community.
absolutely. All right. Well, I am eager to delve into the book and the insights and themes of it, but I would first like to explore a bit more of that professional journey that you described to us, because you have had quite a career as you described. So, um, you have played a major role in many summits and that focus on wonderful inclusions of disability. But let's start with Diversability, something that you founded. And can you tell me a bit more about the original idea and the inspiration you had for creating it?
Yes. So this actually came from my corporate experience. So I studied finance and accounting in college and had a handful of different internships at different financial institutions, and ultimately ended up starting working full time in investment banking at Goldman Sachs. This is now 15 years ago. And I guess what I'll share is I actually didn't identify as Taiwanese or Asian until I was 18 years old. And part of
Okay.
why I share that is because as the daughter of Asian immigrants, my dad is from Taiwan, my mom is from Vietnam. They both came to the US in the 1970s, where I believe there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment. And
Yeah.
so it was instilled in my parents' generation that their pathway to success was through erasure of their race and assimilation. So not drawing any attention to the things that make us different.
Mm-hmm.
So I unfortunately grew up not speaking any other languages other than English, even though my mom, I think, speaks four and my dad spoke three or four. Maybe my mom speaks five. But again, it was, they had, they had accents when they spoke English, and I can only imagine people not listening to them or not taking them seriously, or so many different potential things. So fast forward to Tiffany being an 18-year-old. I'm now a freshman at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and I meet another Taiwanese student. And we both realize that one of our parents is from Taiwan. And I make a comment and I go, "Oh, we should start a club." But I didn't think anything of it, but I had planted a seed with her, and we became the co-founders of Georgetown's Taiwanese American Student Club. So I was
Great.
very actively involved from my freshman to my junior year. And part of why I bring that up is because being part of the leadership team of this club made me feel pride, empowerment, a sense of identity, community, culture, history, all in this Taiwanese American identity that I didn't have before. So after my junior year, I had a summer internship at Goldman Sachs. And while I was there, I got introduced to all of these different employee resource groups that they had. And I actually got to meet the leadership of the Asian of their Asian employee resource group. And I met with her and I was sharing a lot of my learnings of starting the Taiwanese club. And here I am, a summer intern, interacting with someone very senior. She was pretty much like the like executive sponsor of this group.
Yeah.
And while I was there, so I got plugged in with the Asian employee resource group. I also got introduced to their disability employee resource group. And here I was, again, a summer intern, networking and meeting so many people throughout the bank who were part of these employee resource groups. So when I
Mm-hmm.
went back to Georgetown, now I was a senior. I looked at Goldman and I looked at the disability community that essentially I had created at Goldman, and that was my first tease into what it could look like if I entrenched myself in disability communities. And at that point in time, now I'm 21 years old, I didn't identify as disabled. I think that's a journey, a very personal journey for many of us. Even though I had a disability, I didn't identify as disabled. But in some ways, I feel like interning at Goldman gave me the confidence to go back my senior year and say, I know how to start. We started that Taiwanese club. I'm going to start a disability one. And I will say that I want to say I got two strikes and I was waiting for the third strike to not start this club. So a couple things happened was I knew two other disabled students at Georgetown at the time, and I reached out to them and I said, "Hey, I'm thinking about starting this club. Would you be interested in being part of this founding team? Because everything change to me happens in community. Maybe one person has the idea, but you kind of need a little bit of a collective to take some action." But I never heard
Great.
from them, and it could be email overwhelm. Who knows what the story is? But I took that as a response that they were not interested. So that was strike number one. Strike number two was I had started to sprinkle the idea with a couple people throughout the university, and someone on the Georgetown staff knew another staff member who was really passionate about disability studies. So I met with her and I told her my idea, and she told me that she thought the idea was too radical and that Georgetown wasn't ready for a disability club that was centered around disability pride. Keep in mind,
Ah,
this was
really?
2009.
Yeah.
And in 2009, I actually think we were in the earlier stages of exploring what disability pride looked like, although I feel like it's a lot more popularized now in 2025 than it was in 2009. So that was strike number two. And then I was just waiting for the strike number three. And I thought that the strike number three, I got invited to speak on a student panel because Georgetown was exploring a graduate certificate in disability and was hosting like a half-day conference, bringing together all the DC area schools. So I got invited to speak on this disability student panel because I guess I had seeded the idea about this club. Nothing was happening with it yet. And that was actually the first time that I shared the story of the car accident publicly. This October 22nd, 2009, that was the date of the conference. And I had shared it privately on like a need to know basis, but it was usually like it was a whole big thing. And I like would wait until it became like very necessary to share it. And I actually can I go on a brief sidebar and then come back? Uh, so, so the brief sidebar is I remember I did a lot of volunteer activities when I was growing up. And at a lot of these volunteer activities, right, you're bringing a bunch of people who are meeting each other for the first time, and they would always do these icebreaker activities. And one of the icebreakers, I still remember it. Again, I wasn't open about my disability experience, and only a very limited number of people knew that I couldn't use one of my arms. But it was this
Yeah.
one exercise where you had to grab like each other's arms and untangle yourself. And so I just stuck my arm in, and if I don't know if this will end up on video, but my injured hand looks different than my other hand. And so I put both hands in, and someone grabbed my left hand, which is my non-injured hand, and people were just staring at my right hand, but I wasn't saying anything, and it was just like super awkward. So anyway, so I just kind of like have that that childhood memory of like trying to participate in the icebreaker activity,
Yeah.
but it just becoming like a really awkward thing for everybody because my hand looked different. Um, but to come back, so that was the first time I shared the story of the car accident publicly in 2009 at the student panel. And at the end of the panel, I actually said, I don't think it's going to happen, but I had an idea to create a disability student club. And again, this mini conference brought together all these DC area schools. And a student from Gallaudet came up to me after the panel and handed me a sheet of paper that said Diversability on it. And it also said, I'd love to be a part of helping you start this at Georgetown. And for those who don't know, Gallaudet is a university in DC that is for deaf and hard of hearing students.
Yeah.
And that became the beginning of Diversability as Georgetown's first ever disability student club.
Okay.
And so that was very long, but from 2009 until 2014, Diversability was very active at Georgetown, and I'd already graduated at that point in time. But in 2014, there was no leadership handover. So there were seniors who were leading it, who were maybe freshmen when I had started the club. And so I became kind of curious at that point in time around like what the future of Diversability would look like. And I received two messages kind of independent of each other at that point in time. And one was an email from someone who came across an article in the school paper about Diversability. And he kind of shared his story with me, again, someone he never met, and offered to be supportive of Diversability, whatever it looks like in its current form. And then I got a tweet from someone, again, who I never met before, asking what was going on with Diversability because he was living in New York, which is where I was living at the time, and had some ideas of people or networks or communities that I could connect with. So those two messages kind of became the seed for me to realize that maybe we needed like a young professionals group of people with disabilities who would meet and gather so that they would know they were not alone as they were pursuing their careers. So we
Right.
essentially kind of started like a meetup group. This was 2015. And then fast forward to 2020, we transitioned all of our programming to virtual and saw our community kind of uh, grow 4 times. But at Diversability, we do 4 things. I guess everything's coming in fours. Number one is we're focused on ending the cycle of social isolation for disabled people. And
Yeah,
part of how I think ableism gets its power is by intentionally making us socially isolated and excluded and making us feel like we don't have community, because that actually does impact our self-esteem and our confidence. And
absolutely
then
does.
number two is we're hosting events. So we host events, virtual events, actually every single week. But we kind of see ourselves as like the year-round disability conference. So while a lot of places will kind of anchor themselves to key disability months, we want to keep the conversation going. And we do that through our weekly events or through educational content that we put out and amplify across our social channels. And then finally, we run something called the D30 Disability Impact List. And this, to me, at least the only one that I know of, it's our global the only list recognizing disability leadership globally. And it's an open nomination process. So nominations are actually open right now through May 19th. And essentially, I guess the backstory to everything that Diversability does is, when we couldn't find a disability community, we created one. When we couldn't find events that feature disabled speakers, we created them. When we couldn't find a list in our current list obsessed culture, we created one. And when, traditional media wouldn't cover our stories because they didn't think disability was newsworthy, we created media and our own microphone in a way to help get our stories out there.
Right. Right. Okay.
Maybe I should have started with that before going into the into the long story.
No, you know what, Tiffany? I myself am a historian. So I love telling stories sequentially with details as they build up. And so I love listening to your stories. So now, if you were to look at it today, at diversibility as it is today, from afar, do you think that it is accomplishing your original goal?
Ooh. Yes, I do think so. And I come back to what I said before about supporting people on what we call their shame to pride transformation. And I think over the years, we've kind of expanded what we do a little bit, but I keep coming back to the whole point of Diversability to me was so that disabled people didn't feel alone. And I do hear from our community members, or for many of our community members, we may be the first disability community that they've joined. Or
Yeah.
maybe they're newer on their disability journey and not ready to identify as disabled, but want to be witness to things that are going on in the community. So our community is open to non-disabled people as well, and we don't force people to out themselves. And it's been
Mhm.
really rewarding to me to see what I call like the longtime lurkers, like the people who have been in our community for years, but like not really engaged or said anything, finally come out and share, like, I'm ready to share my story because everyone here is so supportive and trying to lift each other up and trying to, do the work.
Okay, that's great. That's great.
I think we could be bigger though. But yeah, and I've been so excited to see so many more niched communities that are coming up. So, there's one called Ramped, which is specifically for recording artists and music professionals who have disabilities. There's docs with disabilities. There are specific patient advocacy groups. And so for me, Diversability is kind of like the catch-all. If you don't know where to go first, come join us and come to the town square, see what everyone's up to, and maybe you can determine if you want to join a more specific community that's more catered to the things that you specifically want to advocate for.
Okay, great. So now why don't we get into the book, Tiffany? So I first heard about you. when I was reading your amazing book called The Anti-Ableist Manifesto. And this book is a great read for all, as it helps both disability advocates such as myself, to hone our skills and to recognize ableism when it's happening, and also for non-disabled readers to learn more about ableism and how to combat it. And for instance, one of the spiritual care leaders here in the facility that I live in is currently reading my copy. And she's saying, man, Hollis, I've done so many ableist things to you. I'm like, okay, yeah. And so, first off, I love the way you organized the flow of the book. And can you please tell the listeners a bit more about your inspiration behind that?
Yeah, so the Anti-Ableist Manifesto. Well, I guess I'll share two things. So one is the book is structured in a framework called Me, We, Us. And this is a framework that I learned maybe about 10 years ago in social impact spaces about how we can create transformative change. So the book says, okay, what do I need to know about disability and ableism and anti-ableism? What do we need to know in community with each other? What are some common microaggressions and how do we interrupt them? And then finally, the us, what needs to happen in order to create the type of systemic and lasting and societal change that I think we're all hoping for. So it could be policy change, it could be closing the disability employment gap, making pathways to entrepreneurship and self-employment more accessible. Talks
Mhm.
about inclusive design. Part three is a lot of what I call like the business case for disability inclusion. You can take the data and the stories to the decision makers and the leaders and say, this is why this matters, and this is why we need to adopt this and be more disability inclusive or prioritize accessibility. And at the same time, at the end of the book, I actually introduced something called the Anti-Ableist Manifesto art,
I
which
love
is
that. I
which
love
is
that.
a piece of art, and I'm holding up a postcard that has about 30 statements on it. And the statements range from disability is not a bad word or a bad thing, don't erase history, diversify your feed, halt microaggressions, we are not your inspiration, we're not a monolith. And essentially, as I was writing the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, and every statement on the art actually corresponds with the chapter in the book. And as I was writing the book, I thought about, when a book is called a manifesto, we kind of want it to be like a call to action or a guide for people as they are pursuing this work. And at the same time, one thing you'll notice as you read the book is that every chapter ends with reflection questions, because I actually think, yes, I'm going to provide you with this manifesto and these statements. And at the same time, I want you to reflect on how that might relate to you, or how you can turn these statements into pieces of action that are going to resonate with you. And I came across this Instagram post a couple years ago that said, ending discrimination starts with self-reflection. And I really like that, because something else I mentioned in the introduction is that learning should never be about shame. So how can I take the shame out of learning? I don't know what your starting point is in this space, and take you along a journey, even if you, Hollis, may already know everything in part one. You may also even know everything in part two or have experienced it. But maybe there's some new thing in there. And I love that you are sharing your copy with someone else. Maybe you read it, you like how digestible, approachable, relatable it is, so that you want to give it to someone else and have them engage with the work as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I personally identified with three chapters in particular. Chapter 5, the history of the disability rights movement. Chapter 6, models of disability. and chapter 21 asks better questions. And I personally connected with chapters 5 and 6 because I learned about those themes while I studied history in university. And I loved the way that you described, the history of certain events in the disability rights movement. So, Tiffany, can I get you to describe certain why you chose certain examples in the disability rights movement to exemplify in your book?
Sure. Are you asking me or you're going to share the examples? Or how
No,
did
I
I?
mean, like, why did you choose specific examples that you chose, for instance?
Ooh. Yeah, and I will say those two chapters, the chapters on the history and the models of disability, those were probably the hardest chapters for me to write because there's so much history, right? There's actually an entire book by Kim Nielsen. I think it's called a History of Disability in the United States or something like that. And
Okay.
actually, there's a book coming out this year by Rachel Charlton Daly in the UK that's about disability history in the UK. So I think I I thought about, okay, let me think about how much context I need to provide before the disability rights movement really started to take off in the 1960s. And then how can we make it digestible enough so that people know what they need to know, and can hopefully dive deeper if there are specific parts of history to carry forward. So that chapter, and you're in Canada, right?
Yeah, I'm in Ottawa. Yeah.
So I also will acknowledge that the book is very US centered. That's where I was born and raised. And so I wanted to make sure I covered key parts of legislation that were happening here in the US and the events that led up to those moments. And then the chapter kind of closes by talking about where we're hoping history might change going forward. And, as we're recording this, we are we are seeing history change. I guess that's the most
Yeah,
PC way to put it. Like, uh, we're,
absolutely.
yeah, we're seeing so many changes happen right now, which also just reminds me that even though this book has been out for almost 7 months, like it's still needed. And I think about how in part two of the book, I talk so much about microaggressions because that's where we make the more overt forms of ableism okay. And right now, we are seeing the most overt forms of ableism happen in front of our face. So yeah, and then with the models of disability, I mean, I found so many different models. In addition, I think to the 8 that I went into detail on. And again, it was how do we structure this in a way that I want you to be familiar with the medical model and the social model
Mm-hmm.
most specifically. The tragedy model is mentioned a lot too. But again, there are all of these other models too. And even as I was doing research for the book, I wrote about the moral model of disability, and I realized that that is the model through which my mom, I think, grew up with. And the moral model of disability is very much rooted in, some ancestral lineage and potentially religiously driven belief systems around disability equating to like some curse or bad luck somewhere in the lineage, and that's why someone has a disability. I think trying to create um, some reason for it. But yeah, how were there? I don't know, how did you kind of digest the information as someone who is a lover of history?
Well, I certainly growing up, I definitely, when I was just when I knew that I was disabled, but I didn't really know, I hadn't learned about the different models of disability at all. And it wasn't until I hit, my undergraduate time in my life that I really saw the different perspectives. And so I originally uh definitely uh found that I identify with the medical model. However, now I most identify more with the social model. And that is what this podcast is all about. Because, it's the 21st century disability, and I feel like in the 21st century, there are a lot of different technologies that are available around you to eliminate uh, many of the barriers that face individuals with disability. So how Judging by the way I read the book, I sort of get that you would identify in the same way in your lifetime. Early on, you might refer to identify more with the medical model, but now that may have changed. Is that correct?
Yeah, what's interesting is I became disabled as a kid, and I actually look back at that because in some ways I feel like I didn't have agency over my body. Like I feel like a lot of
Mm,
other people were making decisions. And so sometimes I call it like the alphabet soup of medical treatments that I was subjected to. And I didn't know what was happening. And it's like also at the same time. So that would be, under the medical model is like, how can we fix this paralyzed arm? And for people
yeah.
who are aware of brachial plexus injuries, which is the name of my injury or the name of my disability, a brachial plexus injury is a lifelong injury. And so even with surgeries or physical therapy or occupational therapy, acupuncture, that was part of my alphabet soup. Um, you may get some nominal movement back, but again, it's still going to be lifelong, right? And so I do think back to that period of time and for some of these, and I never went through any surgeries, but sometimes these kids were getting nerve reconstructive surgeries, and that's medical trauma for a kid who might not understand what's going on, right? And so there's also going to be a mental health aspect to it. But exactly like you said, I think through the lens of the social model, it's really focusing on what are the access barriers that someone is experiencing and how can we ensure that their access needs are met. And like you said, there are technology or other things that are being designed that help remove those barriers. So it's actually, and the social model is like, it's less about what specific disability you have and more specific around what are the access barriers that you're experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I also connected with chapter 21 because I personally agree wholeheartedly about the portion that people need to be teaching kids to ask more meaningful questions. For instance, I love interacting with kids in the grocery store line, and they'll be staring at me asking their mom why I'm in a wheelchair. And I don't, you were talking about this in the book about how you don't want people's parents saying don't stare, right? And also in this chapter you referred to my friend Andrew Jerza. And as I was reading it, I'm like, Andrew Jerza, and I texted him, I'm like, You're in the book I made. Yep. The
And he
intern.
and Andrew has a book out now too.
He does. He does. It seems like an amazing book. Notes from a queer triple. So how have your own experiences with interacting with children influenced your own approach when writing this chapter?
I think the first thing to do is to affirm the child's curiosity. So even in your example of a kid seeing you and saying, why is he in a wheelchair? Is saying, yes, he's in a wheelchair. And then I think creating a dialogue around it, uh, because that's a fact, right? So it's also like, I think for me, and I will say I actually haven't interacted with that many kids. I did meet an 11-year-old who listened to my audiobook with her mom.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, and I was actually really blown away because and this will be a little tangent as well, but I dedicated the book to 9-year-old Tiffany. And I remember telling someone that while I dedicated this book to her, the book isn't for her. Part three, a
Yeah.
lot of it is talking about like closing the disability employment gap and like the disability economy and the disability market. So I met this 11-year-old, and in some ways, it felt like my future younger me. And I don't know, it was really profound. And I've actually been having a lot of profound moments. So I was also like meeting her, meeting this 11-year-old who listened to my book. I then saw her the day after where she brought her hard copy of the book and asked me to sign it to her. Gives me hope that we are raising our kids to be more curious, um, to lean into their curiosity and also understand and embrace human diversity. And, I didn't get introduced to adaptive sports until 2016, which was 19 years after I became disabled. So I was fully an adult. Even my disability was an adult at that point in time too. Um, but it wasn't until I was, 27 or 28 that I tried my first adaptive sport ever. And up until that point in time, and I was subjected to mandatory physical education class, from 9 years old up until I was in high school, of no
Yeah.
one wanting me to be there and no one trying to understand the ways that my body could could move. Um, and yeah, and I think back to I think back to that time. I mean, it was a different time as well. I think so much is changing in our generation, and even with the title of your podcast, right? Disability in the 21st century looks different than it did in the 20th century or even in our parents' generation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
Oh yeah, and
uh,
and I guess to tie it all up in a bow, with the kids is the book, I guess, is appropriate for an 11-year-old. I guess I'll share. And at the same time, uh, yeah, kids are curious, and I think it's not placing any value judgment um, on disability when engaging with them. Again, affirming the things that are factual,
mhm.
affirming their curiosity, and having a conversation around how there are bodies and minds that are different and people are navigating.
Yeah, well, and that's the one thing that I love about your book too, is like I do love how you start out different things by saying 9-year-old Tiffany, 18-year-old Tiffany, or things like that. And I can't For me, I was born with a disability. I've always been disabled. However, your experience with disability is much different than mine. And so it was quite profound to listen to. And that was a great way of incorporating that.
Yeah. And I think that's why I also wanted to make sure that the book incorporated as many. diverse disability perspectives as possible, right? So even as you're
Hmm.
reading that chapter, I'm like citing a tweet that Andrew Gurza put out. I'm like citing
Yeah,
LinkedIn posts. Like I wanted to kind of like your podcast, like I wanted to write it as though we're in disability in the 21st century. So it's like, yes, I'll go, I'll go and I'll look up the academic articles and the books, but also we are shifting and creating and curating our narrative right in front of our eyes through social media. And so how can I incorporate some of those perspectives in as well, in addition to reaching out to people within the community and seeing if they'll contribute stories. But yeah, I did want to, as someone who acquired my disability, I also wanted to make sure that readers understood that that's the lens through which I'm coming into this work.
absolutely. And so, just before we finish, Tiffany, should you let our listeners know the best way to follow you, your work, or get in touch with you?
Yes. So the best way to get in touch is through my website, tiffanyyu.com. And while you're there, you'll see links to the book if you would like to check it out or request it at your local library. That's the free way to get it if you don't want your own copy. And while you're on there, you'll also see links to all of my social channels if you want to connect there and follow and support my work too.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us on 21st Century Disability, Tiffany. It's
Thanks
been
so
a
much for
pleasure.
having me on.
All right.